Let me put up a stopwatch real quick so I know my time.
I got you too.
All right. So, hello. My name is Sam Magonis, as many of you may know. And my senior project is what is the best way to experience arcade games. So, my sub-EQs that I will be going into today are how has the creation of making an arcade game evolved? What do you need in order to make that arcade cabinet? What is a Raspberry Pi? And what does the future look like for arcade games or video games in general? So before we get into all the fun stuff with learning all of the history, because I know that's what we came here for, we first have to know what an arcade cabinet actually qualifies as. So there's many different variations of arcade cabinet. There, like, it goes from not only like the original like Pac-Man and Mortal Kombat things that you're like used to seeing in arcades. There's actually stuff like Dance Dance Revolution, and Guitar Hero. That all qualifies as video games, or like our arcade cabinet. Of course, it qualifies as video games. But there's stuff that you might have not seen as much, like in like a restaurant or a bar or like arcade or senior project somewhere. So now, moving on to the history. Now that we know what an arcade cabinet actually is. So, we go back all the way to 1940s. The first video game was created. It was a missile defense game in the late 1940s using cathode ray tubes or CRT monitors, which are those like big box TVs that you're used to seeing. They're pretty much gone now because, technology. Then we got to move on to the 1950s, which simple games were created using those CRT monitors. Charlie Adama created the bouncing ball game using the Whirlwind computer at MIT, and you can actually see that this is the Whirlwind computer. It took up an entire room on the MIT campus, and it was bonkers. That was the first computer game to display real-time video signals. Then we got to move forward to 1951. Where the Nimrod computer was created by Ferranti International and used a panel of lights as a display. And it had a game called NIM, which was a two-player mathematical strategy game, and that was in 1951. Moving on to 1952, we have OXO, which is basically like tic-tac-toe, developed by Alexander S. Douglas. It was the first digital graphical simulation game, and it was run on the EDSAC computer in the University of Cambridge. And it was known as the first true computer game, and that was in 1952. So, moving on to 1958, which is later. We have Tennis for Two, and that was developed by the Brookhaven National Labs by a physicist William A. Higginbotham, which is the best name to say. It was the predecessor to Pong, which is one of the most recognized video games of all time, and that was in 1958. Moving on to the 60s, we have MIT students programmed Space War on the DEC PDP-1 computer. It was newly introduced and it pinned players against each other in rocket ships. That was 1961. We have the roots of modern day gaming. Like the at-home consoles, like stuff you may know, like the Xbox, PS4. It was like the very, very roots of that. We can see Ralph Baer's Brown Box over here, which it had very simple interfaces, like the introduction to like joysticks and like small buttons and some jazz like that. That was in 1966. It came with the game called Corn Dog, which was the first video game to be played on a standard television that we may see today with like composite, the three things that you had to plug in like with the Wii, because that's our generation. Then in 1967 we see the technological advances of the human interfaces with the introduction of the light gun. Many of you may know what that is. So like if you're playing like Duck Hunt on like the NES, so you know that thing that you point at the CRT monitor, you go bang bang, and then the duck dies. Or if you don't have a good shot, it just stays there. That's what that is. So that was first introduced in 1967. Now moving on to the 70s. It was known as the golden age of arcade games. We had the introduction of our first coin-operated game which was Galaxy Game. That was introduced in 1971. It was installed in the Stanford University. It costed about $20,000 to make, and it had hour-long wait times going outside the building, around the corner, because everybody wanted to play this new technology, because it was so new and it was like so fun for everybody, and like they've never seen it before, so obviously you want to get your hands on it. Then we have 1973, Pong was created. One of the most nationally recognized games. That sold 2,500 units during its first year of release, and then by 1974 it sold more than 8,000 units, which is a lot. So, more of the 70s. We have the development in hardware and human interfaces, i.e. like better like quality joysticks, because there's also like there's different kinds. So this uses different like switches, but there can also be like different kinds. We have more like buttons, stuff like this, because back then they had like stuff not really made for arcade cabinets. It was just like overall like electronic buttons. And then we have like pedals and steering wheels for like racing games. I'm sure all of you have seen the PC Master Race, just like giant, cockpits that people had for those racing games, but it evolved from the 1970s. Then we have the introduction of like games that we know more commonly, like Space Invaders, Donkey Kong, Asteroids, Galaxian, and Pac-Man. That was late 70s going into 80s. Then I'm going to group the 80s to present. There is a lot that happened. It's just I don't obviously have enough time in this 20 to 25 minute presentation to tell you all of it, but I would love to. So we have at-home gaming became big with the introduction of the NES, the SNES, the Atari, and the Sega Genesis, and more stuff like that. We have the introduction of Dance Dance Revolution, Guitar Hero, Rock Band, and those had very, very unique player interaction with the guitar, the drums, the microphone. It was very, very new, and it was very well received. Then in 2013, we have a 4D game was introduced, combining surround sound audio, 3D glasses, vibrations, heart rate monitors, and blasts of air. And that was Dark Escape 4D. Then we have in 2013, Facebook bought out a VR gaming company called Oculus for $400 million in cash and 23.1 million of Facebook shares. And you can see on the screen, we have Pac-Man, we have the Oculus headset, and then we have the old Atari. And I can actually play the Atari on here. This was meant to have a picture. It didn't load because why would it? So that was basically just the transition between like, now we know all of the stuff and how they used to be made and how it took up entire rooms in like college campuses, and we're gonna take all that knowledge and we're gonna build one ourselves, because why wouldn't you? It's an arcade cabinet, it's really cool to have. So, what you will need, we go starting from materials. The original cabinets were made out of this material called melamine. It was very low cost, it was very smooth, and it was very easy to work with. So, as you may imagine, it's a very, very good option for these cabinet makers who don't want to spend a ton of money, but they want like the best profits because everybody's going to be playing those games. So that was the option that they went with. Nowadays, people tend to make their cabinets out of melamine again, furniture grade plywood, or MDF, which is medium density fiberboard, and it's actually what I use in mine. Now you will need a list of different tools like table saw or circular saw, jigsaw, miter saw if you have one, nail gun or screwdriver and drill, depending on what fasteners you're trying to use. And then the rest is really optional. For the future of my project, I plan on putting stuff called T-molding on the outside rims, like right here and right here, to give it a more retro feel. I just couldn't do that with the budget that I had, because that stuff is actually insanely expensive. So yes, and then the rest is really optional. The other electronic stuff you need, obviously a monitor. You can not have a set of speakers, like you really should, and then some sort of human interaction, like joystick and buttons. and you need a Raspberry Pi. Now you may be asking, what's a Raspberry Pi? Oh, I'll tell you, okay? So, a Raspberry Pi is a series of small single-board computers. It's used to promote the teaching of basic computer sciences in third world and developing countries. The Raspberry Pi 1 Model B+, which isn't actually what I use the Model 3B+. It was released in 2014 and it was the size of a credit card. So it's really cool to think that technology has evolved that much that you would need an entire room, and now you can just fit that entire room in the size of a credit card. And after the presentation, if you guys want to come up and look in the back to see how little it actually took to have this emulator, you can. I give you full permission. You can check it out. You can press the buttons and stuff. So the Raspberry Pi can be used for a ton of different things. It can be a desktop computer which can run Linux, a camera, an FM radio, and radio station. It can do robot stuff. It can convert a normal TV to have smart TV capabilities. It can replicate the Amazon Echo or Alexa. It can be a drone, it can be an electronic skateboard, or it can be an arcade emulator, which is what we have. And if you want to know the specs, because I know a lot of you are interested in that, it has a quad-core 64-bit processor clocked at 1.4 gigahertz, 1 gigabyte of SRAM with dual-band Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Now, you know everything. You know everything. Okay, trust me on this. You know everything. Now we got to put that knowledge into actually making it. So what I did was I budgeted it all up, knew what I had to do, made plans, and you'll see I bought everything. So here you can see the testing of the buttons. Over here I made a prototype board to just like place in the buttons, hook them all up to the encoder to make sure that the electronics actually worked before I put them and put the effort and time into actually making the cabinet. So the very first picture, you can see all the buttons laid out, all hooked up to this encoder, which spits out a USB signal to then go into the Raspberry Pi to make it a usable controller. I had both sets of buttons. I ended up using the red ones, and I'm going to use these for a future project. Then the second picture, you can see my first boot up of the operating system, and that is just the beginning text that shows it worked. And this is the Raspberry Pi with HDMI, auxiliary, USB, and flash drive all hooked up to it. So I wanted to actually make a cabinet. So first I went into a program called Onshape, which is available to all Souhegan students, I believe. You use it in engineering classes, and if you're in like Core Math 3, I think, you have to make something out of it. I made a slave, of course, because I'm me. So I accurately dimensioned this. This is exactly what is out here, but I had to build it first in there to make sure that it would all work correctly. And from there, I actually got blueprints. Now these aren't the finished blueprints because, as you can see, we have weird dimensions like 6.083. So my final thing was a lot more refined and done better than that. But this is just, I had like 3 iterations of it. I was originally going to make a full standard cabinet, but ended up not doing that because that didn't fit my use case. So, moving on. You can stop there. You have a fully working arcade cabinet, you have the buttons, but of course we want to go bigger and we want to have more. So I played my last game of Yoshi's Island, and I set out on my quest to make a cabinet. So as you can see here, we have the side panel starting to go on, then you have here the marquee area starting to go on, everything's starting to take the shape of an actual cabinet, and you know, this is where I ran into one of my first problems. So originally my plan was to use 3/4 inch MDF, but while helping a friend with another senior project, we found out that that was really heavy, and I didn't really want that heavy of a material, and I didn't really need it. So in the Home Depot parking lot, me and my dad sat on the back of his truck bed, like explaining how we could use a thinner material and use an air gun to shoot nails from the side into a piece of blocking, which you can see like right in these corners. So we ended up going with 1/2 inch thick material, and that made construction a lot faster, and we didn't have to use screws or countersinks to like spackle them up, you know. and it was a lot easier on a budget too. Moving on to the rest of the construction, we can see the finished product way over here, the primed product, and the painted product. Now, this is a very, very crucial step when you're working with MDF, because MDF is very, very tricky to work with. You don't want to get any sort of moisture near it, because what it will do is it'll actually soak up like a sponge and ruin your workpiece. So you have to be very careful while handling it, at least until you prime it and paint it. So I did eventually 3 coats of primer, and then 4 or 5 coats of black paint just to make sure that it was all nice. And if you can see up here, we have a control board with holes, and that is what we're moving on to. So, making the actual control board. So we took the buttons and the joysticks out of the prototype board. We planned out a layout for the buttons, and then we drilled in with a Forstner bit and a spade bit just to make sure everything was nice. And this is where I ran into one of my other problems. The button, it is 1 3/16, and the closest Forstner and spade bit was 1 1/8, so I had to hand file down a 1/16 of an inch, which took a very, very, very long time. But it came out worth it because, as you can see, it's very beautiful. So I hooked up, I hooked up the buttons to the encoder, and I don't have a picture of it, but the joystick is hooked up to the encoder. I can actually show you because I didn't do this down just for this presentation. So you can see the electronics here. I can't lift it up for people in the back, I'm sorry, because everything will die in a break. But yes, so we have our final board on the very top there. Now, we needed sound. So originally I had a pair of computer speakers that I took apart, and they weren't really as loud and as nice as I wanted, and I couldn't recess them into the front of the cabinet like this. So my dad got some car tweeters from the car auto store, and we drilled a giant hole in to make sure that they would fit. They fit, obviously. And then what I did was I desoldered the ends of the computer speakers and resoldered those ends on. So in that way I would have the volume control and like it would be all hunky-dory. So you can see here the car speakers, the unsoldered leads. Then we had to make something for the monitor so that it wouldn't fall back in the cabinet. And we had to do 2 iterations of this because we realized that this crossbar interfered with the blocking, so we had to do 2 like that, and it ended up working great. Now, as you can see here, we have the almost finished product. You can see that there's a small gap here. That's because the monitor wasn't actually nailed in place, it was just set in place. And the, we needed a few, we needed more finished work that you can see on this next slide. So, this is a finished cabinet. I did go back and do some finish work to get rid of these holes from shooting in the nails for the back of the monitor mount. You can see that they are now gone, and it looks a lot better that way, I think. And I also sanded down the edges so it was more of a smooth finish. I got a little video for you to show you the actual assembly of it. It's just 20 seconds long. My brother helped me make this, so shout out to him. So that's how it was actually constructed. Now we move on to not the video. Oh boy. We move on to the outside expert instead of the video. So my outside expert was a man named Lucian Susi. He owns a woodworking shop in Mount Vernon, New Hampshire, GAM Woodworks, and he actually provided me some tips to give you guys. So if you see my project, or if you see like the online community that's growing, because of these emulation, like Raspberry Pi things, you can do it as nicely and safely as you can. So, we just have a few tips here. We have create a clear area large enough for your project. Keep that area clean during the build. wear safety glasses and make sure that all of your clothing is tucked in while using power tools. And then depending on the material you're working with, dust masks and respirators can help considerably in keeping your lungs healthy. Then we have a little bit more, just some more basic stuff like read all the instructions on glues, dispose of any rags and paper towels because it can have spontaneous combustion, and then try to keep your hands clean because it ends up with a bad finished product if you don't, and then always measure twice, cut once. Now, last thing, what does the future look like for these arcade cabinets? So, obviously I can't see the future, but I can predict. So DIY arcade cabinets, I believe, will become a lot more popular with the online community that is rapidly growing. If you Google MAME forum, you can come up with like thousands of results. The release of the arcade one-up games that you can see at like Walmart and Target, just bringing back these old retro games and having them live a new life again. That's going to become a lot more popular because they're constantly coming out with more games and more games. Then I believe VR and AR will become more mainstream with the constant developments being made in those fields. So, with that said, I'd like to thank my wonderful panel, Jenna Reynolds, Denise Raymond, and Michael Ames. Unfortunately, Laura Gardocki couldn't be here because her brother is getting married, so congratulations to them. Lucian Susi for being my outside expert. He did help me with those tips a lot. My testers who beta tested my cabinet, I know it was very hard work. But, you know, thank you. And then my family, my grandparents for giving me a lot of funds and loving me through all this. My dad especially for helping me build the whole thing. He was there that entire day, like dawn to dusk, just helping me the entire time. And I can't thank him enough. And my mom and brother for beta testing and being there for me. I'd like to thank Olivia Gabbert for helping me prime and paint a lot, and she also helped me with the sanding and the beta testing. She just did an amazing job, and she helped me so much, and I can't thank her enough.